Well, good afternoon. I'm Sherri Greenberg. I'm Chair of Good Systems, and I am delighted to be moderating this panel of experts. We are talking about, of course, work, the new landscape of work, how generative AI is transforming jobs. And I want to thank you for joining us for what I know will be a dynamic discussion on how generative AI is, in fact, transforming the way that we work and what that means for safety and many other facets. So I'll start by introducing our esteemed panelists. They each bring a wealth of experience and different thoughts and perspectives to this conversation that we will keep at about 45 to 50 minutes, and we will still have time for questions. Do not worry about that. So I will start with Amina Al-Sharif. She is a computational linguist and the generative AI lead for state and local government at Google. Originally from Cairo, Egypt, Amina immigrated to the United States in 2010 as a first-generation Arab American and African American. Amina is a member of the LGBTQ plus community, as well as a BIPOC writer. Amina worked with the Joint Special Operations Command for over 10 years as a United States Army officer. A graduate of Penn State University, Amina holds a BA in Linguistics and Arabic from the University of Mississippi and a master's in Professional Studies in Cybersecurity and Information Services. She is currently attending the University of Texas in San Antonio to pursue a career in astrophysics at the Ph.D. level while maintaining a career in cybersecurity, data science, and technology. She is very busy. In January 2020, she published her first book, An Approach to Machine Learning and Cyber Defense for the Department of Defense. Welcome, Amina. Mandy Crawford is the Executive Director of the Texas Department of Information Resources and serves as Chief Information Officer for the state of Texas, a very big job. She also serves on the Texas AI Advisory Council. Mandy is responsible for the overall leadership and daily operations of DIR, an agency with an annual fiscal profile of more than $5 billion. DIR's responsibilities include protecting the state's data and critical technology infrastructure, managing a multi-billion-dollar cooperative contracts program, and providing strategic technology leadership and solutions to all levels of Texas government. Prior to leading the team at DIR, Mandy served at the Office of the Attorney General of Texas for more than 17 years. Mandy is a graduate of the University of Texas at Austin and earned her law degree from the University of Houston Law Center. Welcome, Mandy. Daniel Culbertson is a senior economist at the Indeed Hiring Lab with a focus on the U.S. labor market. Daniel previously specialized in regional analysis and forecasting as an economist with Moody's Analytics and holds a master's degree in economics. Thank you. Art Markman is the Annabelle Iron-Worsham Centennial Professor of Psychology, Human Dimensions of Organization, and Marketing, and Vice Provost for Academic Affairs at the University of Texas at Austin. He wears many hats. He has written over 150 papers on topics including reasoning, decision-making, and motivation. Art brings insights from cognitive science to a broader audience through his blogs at Psychology Today and Fast Company, as well as his radio show podcast, a favorite of mine, Two Guys on Your Head. He is the author of several books, including Smart Thinking, Smart Change, Brain Briefs, and Bring Your Brain to Work. Probably a good idea. I want to start with a question, in fact, for all of you, each of you. Can each of you tell us a bit about your personal experience with generative AI technologies? What are you noticing, observing in your prospective roles about how people are using Gen AI at work? And Art, we'll start right here with you.
Sure, thanks so much, and it's really wonderful to share the stage with this great group of people. And we had a wonderful conversation last week about what we're going to talk about today. I think that in terms of generative AI, the perspective I'll bring today is really, I'll focus a little bit on just the educational impacts here. As Chris Hammond was pointing out in his talk, these are not, AI is not brand new technology, but certainly large language models hit the scene about 1.5 years ago, and immediately doom and gloom was forecast for all education. As luck would have it, we at the university had already had started a process of revamping our honor code to really focus on the acquisition of skills. That learning is fundamentally not about trying to perform particular activities. It's about learning knowledge and skills. And I think that was timely because our real focus at the university is on trying to enhance the learning experience by taking tools and using them to allow us to provide a better education. And so our immediate goal has been to work with faculty to find ways to develop new systems that may help us to enhance the learning experience, whether it's trying to build automated tutors, as have been done in some of our classes like organic chemistry, or whether it's trying to find ways to incorporate this to help people to improve their own writing processes, not to substitute the work that they're doing, but rather to use this as a tool to make them more effective communicators. And so I see this as being something that's going to have a fundamental impact on the way that we teach, but it's going to take us a while to figure out how that shakes out.
Of course. And Daniel, what are you seeing about overall trends in the job market from your vantage point at Indeed?
Yeah, thank you. It's great to be here with you all today. So as a member of the Indeed Hiring Lab, I am part of a global team of economists that use Indeed's data to see what insights we can tease out about the labor market. And especially over the past few years, artificial intelligence and how that's showing up more in job postings is something that we've been focusing on. Overall, I think this conversation is very nascent. We're at the beginning of all this, and it's still very difficult to determine there's an impact in the labor market right now, but the scope of that and where that's going to go is still very difficult to determine. What we see right now is it's starting to show up more inside of job postings, but that impact is somewhat, for lack of a better term, minimal. The number of job postings that have some type of keyword related to AI inside of the job posting stands at about 2.5%. So a pretty small share of the overall labor market. And when you focus that on generative AI, that's an even smaller share. And so we're starting to see this creep in. But as far as answering the big question that everyone has is what type of impact is this going to have as far as worker displacement, it's still a little too early to see.
Thank you. And Amanda, can you talk to us about government agencies and in particular what you're seeing right now?
Sure. So I think, first off, thank you. And I don't know if you can see Art socks. They're amazing. They're fantastic. They've got, the tower, exactly. So they're wonderful. Anyway.
And they go well with the sport coat, I might add.
Well, very, very, very pulled together, very on brand. But so what we're seeing in government is I really kind of like dipping our toes in, particularly with generative AI. I mean, we know that, as was said, and, AI not being a new technology, but really this disruptive potential that could come with generative AI. In government, our perspective on a lot of things is that we don't want to be bleeding edge. We don't want to be even sometimes cutting edge on things because of our role, because everything that we have has to be wrapped in a really thick layer of trust and ensuring that we are not breaking the trust that we have with our constituencies. So it's really about balancing that. So we're looking at what are the appropriate ways and roles to do that, I think, and dipping our toes into that. Personally, at looking at that, I've certainly played around with some of the fun stuff like, golden retrievers and different outfits, because that's kind of fun, like through Midjourney, with some of my first generative AI, but also doing things like using it as a way to prompt for writing speeches, for looking at newsletters. I was at an event earlier this week with CIOs from across the country, and we were asked to present something on blockchain. We had to do a little creative skit. Well, ChatGPT came through, and we asked it to write a song about blockchain to the tune of Chain of Fools by Aretha Franklin. Fantastic, really, really good. The singing was horrible, but the content was great. Those are some sillier examples, but I think that's sort of some of that initial things when we're really talking about generative that we're seeing in government is safe uses to create that sort of initial document prompts for some of the papers that we're working on.
So Yes, prompting and maybe using it as an assistant too is what I'm hearing with the
Correct.
speech writing.
Correct.
Right? And Amina, tell us about industry and what you're beginning to see now in the tech industry with Gen AI.
Well, the tech industry has been in some kind of way for about 1.5 years now, for anyone who's remotely involved in the tech industry. And by the way, I did not plan my outfit, unlike Art. This just happened to be right there in my closet this morning. So, yeah. Oh, thank you. Right, my little frilly socks. I slept in those last night. So I think the tech industry collectively, if we were just to focus on how tech is consuming tech, we have gotten way past the hype phase. The hype phase for us happened very, very early on when ChatGPT hit. But frankly, most of us who are in the computational linguistics or language engineering kind of world, we saw this coming, right? And especially when we were at Google, the one story that I tell, there was an individual who was fired from Google at one point in time for claiming that there was a sentient being that was operating at Google. That being was not sentient, it was Lambda. It was the predecessor to Palm. That event happened back in 2021, right? So the tech industry has been acutely aware of this type of technology and its potential. There's just been a lot of hesitancy that I think almost everyone has commented on right now, which is it ready? And there's a reason why at Google, from the Google perspective, it was sat on for a while. Because there are a lot of unknown unknowns. Let's not even go to the known unknowns, right? So the tech industry right now, in this kind of scurrying to try to make very non-deterministic models do very deterministic things. So for those who understand transformers are going to go, duh, right? In our kind of journey of trying to make generative AI more consumable by enterprises, whether it be a consumer side or an enterprise, kind of use case, we're kind of more concerned about things like context windows and RAG workflows and the ability for these large language models. How far can we test their memory and ability to hold memory when it comes to understanding a large amount of data kind of simultaneously together? Amongst other things like worrying about chips and Moore's Law and how we can't go faster than the speed of light at the moment is kind of a scaling issue for the tech industry in general. So yeah, slightly different, I guess, things that we worry about on a day-to-day basis.
Well, of course, and as you said, you've been worrying about them for a while. We know that AI is in our lives all day, every day, and has been for a while, but we haven't necessarily been worrying about it as long as you have. I want to ask, is generative AI unique in the way it is disrupting work? Are there similarities to be drawn with other technologies that we've adopted in the past, or are we dealing with something different here? Amanda, what do you think?
I mean, think certainly there have been, there are lots of things. Well, I mentioned blockchain now not being widely used in government, but it certainly had sort of the hype around it, that this was going to be the big changer, and people had a lot of conversations around that. So there absolutely have been things that are changers. I think some of the challenges, though, that we're seeing with generative AI, and it kind of speaks to a lot of what Amina was saying as well, it's the speed, and it is the easy access and the democratization of that tool that is just so prevalent and so easy to access. And it is requiring, I think particularly from our space, all of the policies that we have in place for any kind of technology around, governance, around acceptable use policies, confidentiality, all of the security, all of the things that we would have for other things. They're making sure those policies and governance are in place, making sure that we can move at the speed with which that this technology is being dispersed, and just you can go out and put some code into ChatGPT, and or extract code from that in your usage that you could easily have without appropriate boundaries and controls. That information going out, you could have PII and very sensitive information that could be put into a large language model. And this could be for us, constituent information that all of a sudden goes in there, and the speed with which that is then sent out and the difficulty with which I'd heard of a different entity who, in a different state, who had this issue recently with some, resident data that was sensitive, that was put into open source or open large language model, and the process to try to get that back, what that meant, all of those sorts of things. So I think that is one of the challenges, is it has such a chance to go spin out of control with the human error so quickly.
Yes, as I tell my students, once it's out there, everyone has it, and it has a shelf life of forever.
Right.
So what do you think about this? Is it disrupting work? Is it different or similar to other technologies you've seen?
I think yes and no. So on the no side, technology is always a disruption. It's a disruption to the way work goes. And I think that in some ways, this is going to make university education more relevant for people, in the sense that I think the shelf life of particular skills that allow you to get by in the workplace gets shorter and shorter, which means that the ability to learn how to learn and really learn how to take on the next role that you're going to need to take on using the technology is going to become all the more important, that adaptability. And that's a central part of what a university education has always been about. So that's a sort of no part. That's been with us. That may accelerate a bit. The yes part is actually, I think, about university education itself. So, 10 years ago, everyone said, oh, no, the internet was going to completely change universities because of MOOCs. And they were wrong. And I placed a bet that they were wrong, actually, with some people back, 10, 12 years ago, in part because MOOCs were just an opportunity to continue to teach the way we've always taught. Right. It was sage on a stage, only it was sage on a stage on a screen, which is always worse than sage on an actual stage in front of you.
And here we are.
Where generative AI creates a potential for disruption is that as these systems continue to develop, we are going to have the opportunity to provide more personalized and more engaged education for students, which is going to make the sage on a stage less relevant, because now you can take that same information and give people an opportunity to query it at their level of knowledge, and to have something more like a discourse, more like the kind of engagements that actually create learning. Which means that college faculty who are used to doing 3 hours of stand-up comedy a week as part of their classes are going to have to actually create better learning opportunities that are more engaging and more focused on knowledge and skill and attitude development than on just presenting an entertaining lecture.
So not just performing.
That's right. So I do think it's going to disrupt higher education in a way that some of our prior technologies haven't.
Yes, interesting. Daniel and Amina, do you have anything you want to add to that? Is it more disruptive, less, the same?
Yeah, well, Art stole the economist answer to everything, which is yes and no. But I can build on that a bit. And so one way I think this is different is who it's going to impact, or what it's going to impact in the labor market. Like Art mentioned, that we've been automating away labor for hundreds of years now. So that aspect of this isn't new.
So you're going back to the first industrial revolution, right?
Right, exactly. But up until now, a lot of that automation away of labor has been manual labor. And so that impacts a very certain part of the labor market. And generally that would used to, in most cases, just get rid of that job completely. Whereas now this type of technology is probably going to present itself more as a complement to people's roles. This is going to be skills that they're using at work instead of having their work completely replaced. And so that opens it up to a whole different segment of the labor market, primarily knowledge workers that are going to have to learn how to use this technology, and that emphasizes the importance of learning how to learn. So in that sense, that's really the big difference as far as labor market impact.
Yes, with generative AI, we're certainly seeing that this is a potential, a promise and a peril, should we say, for knowledge workers. Amina, anything you wanted to add about Gen AI? Is it different or the same as far as disruption?
I would say no, it is not different. And the reason is because we are in, for those who have fought this long and hard in the machine learning and AI space, we're in the early days of DNNs, right? Remember when neural networks first came out and people were kind of freaking out about them? Not the first time, right, back in the 80s, and actually going all the way back to the 60s when they were first referenced to. but like the second time, which was like maybe 5 or 10 years ago, when people were like, oh, we can actually use these to do some really cool and interesting and complicated things, but they were kind of abstracted away. I think the main difference with generative from a consumer behavior perspective is it was introduced to the market differently. From a data scientist point of view, though, the existence of transformers and their mathematical architecture is to us not new or novel, since the attention is all you need paper. And the progression of AI in this kind of architecture and style is starting to lean more towards, we're still in that mixture of experts phase, right, where we still need many different experts to work together to even remotely mimic even a single task that a human does. And I think that's kind of commenting on like the automation in the job industry piece is, you know, once upon a time, a chandelier like that had a person dedicated to lighting the candles and turning them out. Right? And now we don't have that, right? And the way I equate it on the storytelling side is an uncle of mine worked in the actual manufacturing industry, and he made steel. That was his job from the start. And then they invented robots that were essentially able to go and do that job for him. And so then he had to learn how to operate the robots. And then eventually the robots started coming with sophisticated enough software that they were pretty much autonomous, but needed some regular upkeep and checking in. And suddenly the nature of his job totally changed. I see that full cycle as just continuing with generative AI. I don't think it should be treated as any more new or novel than the next disruptive technology that we saw in the space.
Interesting perspectives. What are some opportunities you think Gen AI can help us unlock at work? And Daniel, I think you were starting to talk about that. So maybe tell us more about what you think the opportunities are that Gen AI can help us unlock at work. You were starting to talk about, you know, that this is a situation now where workers of different skill levels, right? Their jobs are changing, being created because of Gen AI. Excuse me.
I mean, I think that depends widely on the type of job that we're talking about, but I'll go back to that learning how to learn. This presents just so much more opportunity for knowledge workers of all types to really upskill themselves, and it's going to be, you know, something that I keep hearing people say is that it might not be AI that's going to take your whole job. It's going to be someone else using AI that's going to take your role. And so, yeah, just that opportunity to continually upskill yourself. And, you know, when we say, oh, this is going to be a complement, this is going to be a skill that workers use, a lot of that is just scale. It's going to allow workers to do more with less, and then that presents a lot of other questions about, will this make workers too productive and reduce demand for workers over the long term? But that's another conversation. But yeah, just that opportunity to learn and to do more with less.
Art, what do you think about that?
I have real concerns about the potential for us to be providing information to people that they're not capable of using. So what I mean by that is, you know, right now, if you want to get a data analysis done on a large data set, you generally have to engage with your data and analysis team to get the analysis done. And the analysis that comes back to you comes with a little bit of information about what that means and how you might think about that.
Some context.
And as we move towards systems where you can dump a data set into an AI system and then give a natural language query that comes back with some information, now you have people who aren't necessarily trained in looking at data to answer questions, who now have data, who will have a bit of an illusion of understanding that, you know, and I have several concerns about that, like, you know, will they even recognize when the system is given a completely ridiculous answer because it did the wrong analysis and you don't understand enough about data to even recognize that, let alone that if you're not, it takes a certain amount of training to know how to answer a question with data. And so there's a lot of upskilling we're going to need to do for people to make sure that and that's just one example, but the idea is that as we start making it easier for people to get access to particular kinds of information, we're going to have to do a lot more training for people to learn how to reason with that kind of information, or we're going to end up with people making very bad decisions on the basis of thinking that they have really good information.
That does sound dangerous. I want to turn our attention to ethics. Why is a commitment to ethics and discussions around shared values important in this ever-changing work landscape? And what does a commitment to ethics actually look like in practice? Amina, I know that you have worked with DoD. Is this something that you perhaps have been thinking about?
Yeah, so for context, I was one of the principal machine learning architects and engineers that was on Project Maven, which you may or may not have read about in the news. And not only was I there as a Googler, wearing my Google badge, but I was still in the service. So I was also still wearing the uniform. It was a very interesting time to see ethics in AI pretty much start right about when my formal career with AI started, when I joined Google. I have a very strange and nebulous look at ethics when it comes to trying to do what we're doing with machine learning and AI, which is essentially the very intrinsically human survival mechanism of making patterns out of nonsense around us, right? So we need patterns in order to establish understanding and comprehension of the world around us. Well, that's what we're doing with generative AI today. We're taking math, we're exposing it to data, and the result is a compressed mathematical representation of that data, right? And so the issue of ethics and responsible AI, first of all, to be abundantly clear, from a practitioner's perspective, to me, Gen AI ops, machine learning ops, DevSecOps, and DevOps all fall under ethical and responsible AI. Every single one of those practices do. Because if you don't include that level of understanding, I also don't like the black box argument. I'm not a proponent for the black box argument. If you fight for that level of understanding of what your system is that you're implementing, at the end of the day, you would have done it responsibly, according to whatever framework you and your team works in, which is my last point about, with generative AI, I mean, gosh, we're in Texas, right? Like, there are alternate realities everywhere, all over the place, and all kinds of, different groups of people. And so my argument is, instead of trying to stomp things out and figure out what's right and what's wrong, let's take the approach that we've taken, frankly, in data science through what we call mixture of experts, which is the models need to be as diverse as the people who use them, right?
Right.
So that's kind of my very long commentary on the subject of ethics and AI.
Amanda, what about in government, ethics and Gen AI?
So this is, definitely one of the things that, as you mentioned, Sherri, the AI Advisory Council that was created by House Bill, now I'm going to say it, 2060.
In the last legislative session.
Last legislative session. I think it's 2060, but, there's a few other 1,000 bills that were there. But part of the charge, when you read that, the bill and the charge for the AI Advisory Council is to address specifically this.
Right.
And concerns about privacy, constitutional protections, bias, all of those things, and really have a conversation around it, particularly as it comes to, automated decision-making systems. And the concern, if you see from state leadership, is really about, anytime you would have any sort of system that is making, whether it's a supported decision or a final decision, removing the human, or even if the human's in the loop, are there parameters? What do we as a state, or particularly a state government, what do we need to do to put into place to make sure, the best that we can, that there are these protections for that? So these are the conversations we're having. We've had 2 meetings thus far, and we're bringing in folks from both the public and the private sector to have those conversations. It's not an easy thing to nail down. And as Amina said, sometimes it can be very nebulous. But I think that kind of foundational and core, and it goes back to my earlier comments about trust, is there has to be transparency. And I think that's really the baseline for this. If what we're looking as these in practice would be having a transparency to our constituencies to make sure that they understand what data is being collected, where it's being stored, how it's being used, everything around that, and how are these decisions being made? I mean, the conversation or the question that was asked earlier about the would you allow, or would you be comfortable with a jury that was essentially an automated jury to do this? You could extend that. What if you had a doctor and you went into a doctor for a medical diagnosis, the doctor consults uses AI to come back and gives you a diagnosis. Does the doctor have an obligation to tell you that they have used and consulted some sort of system? Those sorts of things, when it comes around, where do we draw the line? What are the concerns? What are things that we're like, oh yes, most definitely here, but not there? And it's very hard to read that out and sort of multiply and scale that out when you're looking at the vast scope of services and the interactions that people have every day with government. And so the goal is to try to lay some sort of foundational practices. But again, I think it's just going to have to start with transparency, and it's probably going to be iterative. And mistakes will be made because we are human, and that's what will happen.
And government is huge. Texas
Correct.
state government is huge. Could you give an example of something where you're using transparency, or where you think we should have transparency with Gen AI if you were using it in Texas state government?
Well, sure. So I could, think of some of the things, for example, so to be clear, first off, as far as generative AI in mass practice and the kind of things where these decision makings, they're very few and far between.
Right. So
government.
hypothetically.
I do think it would be some of those things that particularly around human services and those things. So many times the folks' interaction with government is typically on some of the most personal and intimate aspects of their life, whether it's dealing with child support, it's, need for... other kinds of services. There's these very, personal issues, criminal justice systems. And so, for example, if we're using some sort of technology to help detect fraud across multiple systems, an obligation to say, it's an opt-in to having this used across different platforms to make sure that you are who you say you are, that we can not only connect you perhaps with services that exist elsewhere. If you're consuming these services, perhaps you'd also need to have these, but also using it for fraud protection. Those sorts of things, I think, again, just saying how your data and information is being used is going to be key.
Okay, thank you. I wonder how we see employer and employee expectations changing and shifting with what is now widespread adoption of Gen AI in some areas and this iterative adoption in other sectors. How can employers be responsive to shifting employee expectations at the workplace as it relates to incorporating Gen AI and other transformative AI technologies? Daniel, you're certainly in a place where there are lots of different employers you're looking at. What do you think?
I don't know if I have a great answer for that one. I think a lot of that is still up in the air, but I do think it's causing a lot of employers to evaluate everything that they do, and that can include how they manage the workers that are currently in the building, but then also that hiring process is a whole nother animal. A couple weeks ago, I was in a meeting with a client of Indeed, and she worked for a big company that we've all heard of, and one of the questions she asked me was, how do we stop candidates from using AI during the interview process when they're doing some type of assessment, because they're sitting on the other end of a screen and they can have that pulled up right next to them.
So if you give them a writing prompt, for instance.
Something like that, or even computational tests or programming, things like that.
Of course.
I mean, that was another question that I didn't have an answer for, and yes and no didn't work on that one either. I think it's just a reevaluation of that whole process. And then, speaking again on that hiring standpoint, this is something that Indeed as a hiring platform thinks about a lot. And two main focuses of our AI policies are fairness and that hiring is human. Fairness in the sense that at Indeed we believe talent is universal, but opportunity is not. And even in that human process, human hiring process, there's a lot of ways that unfairness and that bias can creep into the process. And when you start to scale that with AI, you need to be mindful of that. Similar to Art's example of, you can dump a data set onto somebody, but do you know that that's making sense? You can scale that hiring process, but you need to have those sanity checks to make sure that bias isn't creeping in.
So perhaps it's a position where the AI is using solely historical data and all the people in that field looked a certain way. Yeah. However, we now have people who are perfectly well suited and trained, but they're being perhaps thrown out of the pool because they don't look like the historical demographic. Would that be that kind of situation?
Exactly that, yeah.
And Art, again, what about at UT? We're a big entity and a big employer and lots of employees.
Yeah.
Is it shifting? Is it changing?
Well, it's a new tool, and it's going to be pervasive, and it's going to influence things. I mean, I think, from our standpoint, it's a matter of thinking about what is the appropriate use of this new tool, and how do we train people to do it well. I mean, as I mentioned earlier, we were lucky enough that we were already in the process of revamping the honor code when ChatGPT came up, so it gave us a natural way to start talking about what is the purpose of education. Right? I mean, each of us has a stance that we need to take when we're dealing with tools, and to use them in an appropriate way, and to understand how to use them in the best possible way. I think that's going to be true for our students. It's going to be true for our faculty. It's going to be true for our staff, as we begin to think about what are the ways that we can make certain workflows easier. What are some, and how can we train our faculty and our students, and our faculty and our staff in particular, to make the best use of this new tool to improve the experience that everyone has coming here.
So let's stay on that topic for a while. We've heard about skills needed and reskilling and upskilling and skills that students will need. Art, we'll start with you. What do you think are some of the specific critical thinking skills that students will need? And what do you think that we need to do to have a workforce that will be nimble in the way that we're speaking of in the future?
Yeah, I think that the number one thing is to really become adept at learning how to learn, because that has been true for 30 years. That pace is going to increase. We have to be willing to recognize that the job skills that we're making use of today are not even going to be the skills that we're necessarily using 2 or 3 years from now. So we have to be willing to take a good look at the work that we're doing today, understand how we might be able to do it more effectively with tools, and then begin to engage in that question of what additional training do I need, what additional education do I need in order to be able to continue to advance my own skills. I think that is going to be the crucial thing that is going to separate people who continue to succeed in the workplace from those who end up falling behind, is that we're all going to have to up our game. And I think that's why, one of the reasons I like to point out that college faculty, for example, are going to have to fundamentally change the way that we start teaching over the next several years because of these technologies, is to make it clear that even people who thought, yeah, I know how to learn and I'm pretty secure in the stuff I do, are actually going to have to undergo a pretty massive shift in the way that we think about our jobs. And I think that ethos is going to have to filter through everyone that we engage with at a university.
And Amanda, what do you think?
No, I really, I've been thinking about this a lot. One of the things, and to contrast this with the change with AI, is one of the things that we've been working on in the state to address some of the workforce shortage that we have around technology workers. And so we do things like, no offense to my brethren in institutions of higher education, dropping 4-year degree requirements for a lot of technology positions, looking for certifications, going out and really looking at those, almost turning some of IT and a lot of what's being done into more of a trade. And now as we're looking, what I'm thinking and what we're really talking about now is we're looking at what do we need as generative AI, inevitably becomes a tool that we use that can increase this productivity. To Art's point, we need more critical thinkers, and we need people who are also empathetic and compassionate and truly understand the fundamental core of a lot of these, particularly in the human services area of government, so that if you're using AI to be able to deal with massive caseloads, once you get to that human part and the human in the loop, you truly can make, with that critical eye and that eye towards empathetic leadership, look at that to assess, was it an accurate determination? Is this the right pathway to go? Are we truly being able to decipher and going through some of the answers that may be coming from these automated systems to make sure that it is the right decision to be made for these very, very real and personal interactions that government has with folks?
So Amanda, you mentioned training and academia. How do you think industry, government, and academia can work together to advance this conversation about ethics in AI, about jobs and the future of work?
I think it's obviously it starts with conversations like this, but I think we do need to partner together more frequently to talk about what are we seeing on the front lines, whether it's in the private or public sector, for what we need from our workers. What is it that we need? And then reaching out to academia to say, here's what we're needing. Can you help us to build out the curriculum and the skill set to make your students and your graduates more prepared to help address these needs? I think it's a great start.
So don't worry, we're getting to Q&A, but before we do that, I'd now like to ask each of the panelists to share, if you could have just one call to action for us to hear today, as we're talking about this new landscape of work and how Gen AI is transforming jobs, what would that be? And Amina, we'll start with you.
4 words: stay curious and get started.
Okay.
That's it.
That
Just go do it.
That's an A+.
I know.
Okay. You did it. You did it. One sentence.
I don't want to follow that.
What's your call to action? Your one
My
takeaway?
call to action, I guess, some of the other things that I talked about is helping, I guess, with ideas, with use cases. This is really more my call to action to folks in the private sector who frequently will come to us, and also academia in your position with research. If you're seeing use cases, if you're seeing ideas out there that you think would be good applications, I encourage you to reach out to those of us in government, because we want to hear from you. And we also want to hear your ideas as we're talking about the guardrails and the protections that we need to put in place to protect Texans from any potential misuses of the technology. So please come forward. We want to hear from you.
Great. So you want to hear from constituents. Wonderful. Daniel?
As someone that works for a hiring platform, I'll go back to that keeping the human element in the hiring process. And the way that I say that, or the reason I say that is, even if you don't work in the private sector and even if you're not a manager, there's a very good chance that nearly everyone in this room at some point in their career is going to be involved in the hiring process. And keeping that human element means, making sure to keep fairness inside of the process, making sure you understand the technology that you're using and how that is scaling and any potential problems that might be there. And just going back to what Amanda said about the empathy that's involved in that, keeping that hiring process human is a great tool for keeping that fairness in the hiring process.
So keeping the hiring process human-centered, perhaps? Human in the loop?
As human as possible, or having that human in the room for sanity checks. Yeah.
Sure. And Art?
Yeah, my call to action is actually, this is going to seem roundabout, but I think my fellow academics, my fellow folks in higher education actually need to help to articulate the value of degree programs and the 4-year college education, because I actually, to disagree with my fellow panelists,
Love it.
I actually think that the fundamental problem with some of the micro-credentials is that they teach a very narrow set of skills, which has a very short shelf life. And I think what degree programs actually do well is to teach people how to think. And I think we need to prize that. We need to value that. And we need to articulate that value rather than assuming that it's obvious that value exists.
Thank you. We have some time now for questions. Please step on up. Yes.
Hi, I'm Zan Van Loon, and I work for TSU, but also Texas Workforce Commission. So I follow you. I knew a lot. So I would like to find out how, one of the things I do is I help TWC get started using AI responsibly and effectively. How do we get started?
Well, first off, I want to say that I think that TWC has done, the Workforce Commission did a lot of great things with AI, particularly during the pandemic when we had the, unforeseen and absolutely massive influx through the UI system.
Absolutely.
And we're really one of the first state agencies to take a chatbot and really put it out there to be able to respond to the needs of Texans at that time. And so, kudos to y'all. I think part of it is, so one of the things we have in Texas government is we have the AI work group. and this is practitioners and people throughout the state. We have more, since we created it, gosh, I want to say 6 months ago, 8 months ago, there's more than 400 members. And they come in and they share best practices, AI policies, governance, and ideas. And so it just goes back to my other thing, be out there, be bold, come up with ideas on ways that you think that it could be implemented. I think there has been, again, like I said earlier, there's a little bit of hesitation. In government, no one wants to be first, no one wants to be last. And so there's a bit of hesitation until we know what those guardrails are that we are seeing from state leadership. But it doesn't mean we can't get things on deck, and it doesn't mean that we can't get started with some ideas to really make a change.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next question.
So you guys were mentioning education and how we need to rethink our education structures and systems, but for low-income communities who might not have the same access to these technologies, how do we ensure that we change the structure so that folks are still getting a value out of their education trajectory or whatever they're doing, and ensure that we're not widening the gap between those who are low income and those who are upper middle class or high income?
Okay. Art?
Well, I think you've raised a really important question, and I think I think raising the question is actually one of the first important things to do to make it clear that our future, as William Gibson said, is not going to be unevenly distributed. But I think that my hope is that AI systems have continued to be incorporated into almost everything that we do in ways that make technologies that seem like they're only going to be available to a small number of people, available to much larger numbers of people over time. So, there are, as Chris Hammond was pointing out in his talk, there are recommendation systems now in every system for everyone. So we have. My hope is that over the next several years that the technologies underlying these current systems that are having an impact on education will become cheaper and more widely available by virtue of just the way that technology tends to get less expensive. But I think that we need to be vigilant about making sure that we create access to those tools, not just to students at elite universities or students whose parents are wealthy enough to be able to afford them, but for everyone, which means we're going to need to monitor the cost of those technologies, monitor the distribution of them, make sure that to the extent that they are accessible primarily through the internet, that the internet capacity is available in small rural communities as it is in larger metropolitan areas, and to really ensure that we're building access, and that's going to require paying attention to that.
Next question.
Hey, thanks. As LLMs and chatbots get better at interviewing candidates for jobs or entry to anything, or certifying them as really good at X task, why can you justify going to a university other than the learning? Sometimes you go to the university because you want the certificate that proves you have this knowledge. But if an LLM can ask you all these questions and therefore you can prove that, does that erode the reason to go to a university?
No. No, and I mean it's a great question, but I think the fundamental misunderstanding, and this is something that we as universities need to rectify, is that the fundamental value of the university education is in helping to create flexibility in thinking, helping people to understand the broad contexts associated with the situations they're in, giving them levers for engaging in systems-level thinking, and giving people a discipline. We call these things, we throw around the word discipline to say, I studied history or I studied psychology, and that's a discipline. But the word discipline fundamentally means I have developed a mode of engagement with the world that allows me to take a difficult and unstructured problem and tame it through a set of methods that I learned over a period of time in my degree program, And we as university administrators, as university faculty, have to articulate that more, because that goes well beyond simply having a sheet of paper that qualifies me for a particular job. It's the thing that certifies that I'm going to stay relevant in my ability to do knowledge work, not just 6 months after graduation, but 6 years and 60 years after.
So learning how to be lifelong learners.
That's right.
Yeah.
See another question? Yes.
Hi, all. Thank you so much. I'm Sam Baker. I'm an English professor on the Good Systems Executive Committee. It's a wonderful panel. Amina, I've got two, I think, closely related questions for you. The first is about, I'd be curious to hear more details about the mixture of experts approach that I heard you recommend for generative AI. If you see that approach being something that would be implemented in the gathering of the training data and in that process, or if it would be more about the ways that a system would call to particular expert knowledge that would be out there to be found, to be gathered. And relatedly, Google search will typically serve up Wikipedia entries, right, as as first order information in response to search. Is that something you could ever see being replaced by an algorithmic choice or ranking, or maybe even just random serving of different expert takes?
Amina?
Yeah, okay, so those were two amazing questions. Let me start with the first question. Mixture of experts and the concept of a mixture of experts, for those in the audience who are not data scientists, basically, mixture of experts is exactly what it sounds like. It's many different systems working alongside one another to accomplish a single task. The majority of consumer-grade AI that you see, which I did want to touch on that point on accessibility that we got from the back, anyone with a phone that has Gmail on it is consuming AI on a daily basis, right? So if you think about some of these free tools, they're free. I work for Google, I should know this. They're free because you are the product, because we want to know you more, better, so that we can get you onto more productive things, right? So the mixture of experts piece, actually what predates that from a data science perspective is the ensemble model. Right? So the idea of just taking a bunch of different models, whether they be, standard classifiers or regression models or early statistical models, line them up together and you get a desired result. Social network analytics, for anyone who's done some of that from the socioling side of the house, right? You mix a couple of different algorithms together to get things like proximity, closeness, eigenvector distance, right? So this idea of mixture of experts, as far as we're concerned on the data science side, is not going to go away, because just as diverse as it is to be a human and do things that humans do, we require that same diversity out of math as of right now. There's no single math language that we can point to say, aha, this is a standard that we can all congregate over. I think that's why for some, and there was a very, very notable person at Google who decided to step away when Gen AI started becoming a hype, and I'm not going to name names, but for those in the audience who know, they know. Yeah. Some believe Gen AI might actually be that first stab at that one common language to do all the things without the need of or for a mixture of experts approach. However, to kind of wrap that in a bow, it's interesting that you came from the English department, because that's actually where I ended up with my Ph.D. Long story, I need to update my bio. But one of the biggest challenges that we're looking at right now is holding context with large language models, which I mentioned earlier, of having the ability to have enough memory to actually be able to comprehensively answer a question or respond with a grounding mechanism in a coherent way. Where is that drop off? The answer to that question right now is unknown. Until then, things like retrieval augmented generation and React and prompt engineering are all acting as little modalities. So to tie all of that in a bow, what I think we're going to be looking at is a very agentic year, is a term that is appearing actually, ironically, on LinkedIn right now. a very agentic year when it comes to large language models and chaining them together to actually get the desired result that you're trying to get. That is the level of maturity that we're operating at industry now. If you're still in that kind of novel phase of just hitting a single model and getting a single kind of answer out of it, most enterprises have moved on at that point to these more agentic systems, which do look like mixture of expert systems. For the second question, I honestly, there's not much I can comment on insofar as Google search is concerned. However, what I can comment on, and to be abundantly clear, outside of my capacity of being someone who is at Google, is the way we search for information is going to go through just as much of a transformational process as critical thinking is at universities, right? We're really at a point right now as a human race where we need to fully understand where is it that we're willing to go and how far are we willing to push ourselves as these systems start automating certain aspects of our life that, frankly, for the most part, are laborious, right? Like they're repetitive, right? Do you want to write a cover letter from scratch every time? No, not really. That's why you have 10 versions, right? So, yeah, insofar as that goes with search, you're going to start seeing Google search change in some very, very large ways, I think, over the course of the next few years. And it's gone from reactive search to predictive search. And I think that's where you're going to start seeing the search area move, is instead of just trying to react to what it is that you want, with generative AI that's personalized to you, can we just predict it instead? Which is where we all knew where we were going, if anyone pays attention to Gartner and the data maturity scale, right? That's kind of where we're all headed. So.
Thank you. Okay, I see 3 people back there, and we have about 2 minutes left. So this is what I'm going to propose. Each of you gets about, I would say, 4 words for your question, and then we're going to have about a 4-word answer. So go for it. What's your 4-word question? And we're going to have a 4-word answer, and then we're going to move to the next and the next.
All right. So I'm just going to say thank you for the nice panel.
Okay, wait, question?
But I had 2 questions, one for Art, one for Amanda.
You get one.
Okay, I'll take it as a good Longhorn. But the question for Art is, I have 2 kids. All of my family is Longhorns, but what are we going to do so that parents like me can actually help the kids or convince the kids to go for a graduate study course?
Okay. Convince the kids to go for graduate studies. All right, 4 words.
It's the only way to have a sustainable future.
Got it. Okay. Next. Step on up.
Can I do an introduction? No?
Nope. What's your question?
How do you expect students to use AI?
We hope they're going to use it in all sorts of ways, right? I mean, to generate ideas, to learn to write more effectively, to learn how to use AI as part of process for the work that they're going to do. We're hoping to build automated tutoring systems for certain disciplines where that's going to be easier to do, so that you get a personalized experience. We hope that this becomes part of the daily experience of being a student.
Okay. And next.
So this is related to the discussion on transparency, but essentially, do companies like OpenAI or Google have an obligation to make their generative AI technologies open source?
Who wants to take that?
I mean, obviously I do, right? You called me out. I think there is a time, but here's the way I'm going to put it. Again, not associated with my Google identity whatsoever in that capacity. I think Google is obligated to be transparent on what its systems have trained on, right? Because the majority of these large language models that people are trying to consume for work, for government, are trained on Reddit data sets. Right?
Right.
So if anyone knows about Reddit, right,
yes.
it's a little small disaster.
It's a little scary.
Yeah, there's an obligation for transparency, in my humble opinion, from every company, so that any purchaser or person who is approaching that wants to use their services knows what they're buying. On the other hand, I think there is a time and place in the current state of our economy, and we can talk about capitalism, but I'm not going to go there, of There are companies that develop IP that have the right to retain that IP. And some of those companies are the only companies that have gathered enough resources over the course of the last 20, 25 years to be able to run those capabilities. So if you ask those companies to open source their technology, you're therefore then also asking them to open source a resource that consumes anywhere from 1 to 10,000 bottles of water per ChatGPT query that you make, right? So there's an economies of scale piece here that comes to play that everyone needs to acknowledge.
So
right?
it's complicated.
Yes, definitely.
I want to thank our wonderful panelists for such a tremendous discussion.